Respect for one's elders shows character.
I have character.
Because you are a character doesn't mean that you have character.
If you know anything about me, you know that I go up for Honda. BMW, I definitely go up for as well, but Honda has a very special place in my heart. They are most people's first cars. They're most people's reliable cars. There's most people's experience with cars because it is a relatively simple and free experience. But there goes a step beyond Honda, and that is Acura. Now, if you've seen my video, hopefully you have, in the last couple of weeks where I explored the ZDX, what I thought about it, and that got me to thinking, what happened to Acura and what is the pinnacle moment at which Acura becomes mediocre? That's what we'll be exploring today in today's video. So with that being said, stick around and stay tuned because you are now watching the breakdown. Roll 'em. So before we get started, I want to let you guys know now, this is not going to be a count by count history of Acura. This is going to focus more so on the mid to late 90s and the early 2000s as a very critical period. But I want to let you guys know now, this video may be a little longer than you're used to. I'm going to do my best to put the chapters in there so you can kind of jump back and forth. But I want to give a full disclosure because y'all know I can talk and y'all know I can bore y'all to death. That being said, let's go ahead and take that deep dive into the history of Acura, more so into what the happened. If you know anything about Acura, you know that Acura has been around since the late 80s, mid to late 80s to be specific. Acura did not initially start out in the North American states. It actually was a prototype over into the European area under the Rover name, and it was a joint venture between Rover and Honda. Rover used the body and the clamshells, while Honda used the engine parts, collaborated together to create the Rover 800. Now, this was known as Project XX, and this was supposed to be kind of a joint project between the two, but Honda is notorious for testing the market, dipping a toe in the water to really find out what the is going on. And so because of that, they use Rover as a joint venture, and you'll begin to see that a few times in Honda's lineup. Honda essentially wanted to get a piece of the luxury market. During the 80s, the Germans was beating everybody's ass. And I think part of that is because of the yuppie culture that was going on during the 80s and what it meant to be upper class life. And so many upper scale citizens were driving around in Mercedes, BMWs, Audis, with the exception of that time that the Audis ended up, they wouldn't stop braking because they were braking in the 80s. And that too needs to be studied. And I think I'm gonna do a three-way series about Infiniti, Lexus, and Acura to kind of tie it in together. Let me know in the comments what you think. But anyway, during that time, Honda basically said back in 1981, look, we want to create a luxury division, and then they would work with Rover to create the Rover 800. And the reviews are great. They said that it drove amazing. They said that it had all of the qualities we knew about Honda, and many of the people that drove one said that they enjoyed it and it was a fairly reliable car. And you can find a fairly cheap one over in Europe for less than, I think, about 8,000 pounds or something like that. But you can't really find too many of them because the car's damn near 30 years old. You're not gonna find one.
Give it up, Delicious. You look like a man.
At the time, it had 134 brake horsepower engine and got from 0 to 60 roughly around the 8 seconds. You could get 198 horsepower turbocharged engine if you want to, and the turbocharged is gonna play later down the road in Honda's lineup, so hold on for that. But the 80s was a very interesting time for Honda. The introduction of the Legend and the Integra were critical because those were the first two models that were launched, and in comparison, the second generation, both Integra and Legend were definitely great freshers and replacers and successors, whatever the you want to call it that day. They were great, and we began to see towards the beginning of the 90s where Honda really takes Acura into a complete stratosphere, beginning with the NSX. The NSX in its original heyday was basically a secret project by Mr. Honda himself. It was all aluminum body, had a 3-liter V6 that was roughly around 270 horsepower and 252 pound-feet of torque, and had a screamer of an engine because it basically was a Ferrari car. It was a Ferrari competitor. There had been nothing like that up until that point, and we began to see the flux of Honda basically saying, baby, I'm tired of y'all fucking around with me. Y'all think I just be doing economy boxes. Wait the till you see this shit. When they dropped the NSX, it was something that had completely been unseen. And then they would drop another banger. Before they actually released the NSX, the Legend was already released, and the Legend was lush. Oh my gosh. If you have ever seen the second gen Legend, now it came with a 4-speed automatic and it came with a 6-speed manual as an option, and it came with
all the hits.
So it came with a single overhead cam V6 that didn't get quite as much horsepower. It got 200 horsepower, unlike the NSX, but that thing was smooth. When I tell you,
that motherfucker slapped.
Mama, you ain't gonna keep this shit together with Gator gone.
Come here, you little black bitch.
and my favorite part about the Legend is the back seats, because for whatever reason, they never get used, so they always look pristine when the car is being ready to get sold. But the design, the interior was finely appointed. The design of the car, I know I'm speaking backwards. Most people talk about the design first, but y'all know I got ADHD, so I just be talking. But the design of the outward appearance and the hood was longitudinally opposed. You begin to see the intention behind what Honda was trying to do. They were truly trying to emulate what the Germans were doing, but putting their own fresh take on it. Now that becomes a recurring theme in Acura's lineup, because they basically are like, you know, we want to try to compete a little bit, but we're gonna slide over a little bit our way. You also begin to see them like, no, we really need to compete with the Germans because we're losing sales, because sales drives everything. And so even in the Legend state, you begin to see a smoothness. It was a front wheel drive chassis, but it still gave you that rear wheel drive look. It came with sunroof, Bose stereo. Let me tell you the way that the 90s was hitting with the Acurites. But that was what set the precedent of Acura, in addition to the NSX. And then we even get into the even bigger model, which is bigger than the both of those, which is the Integra. Now the Integra, unlike the Legend and the NSX, was a small Civic-based sedan. And this was not the first generation, as I said before, but the second generation really showed us what it was capable of. The second generation is the one that came with a VTEC dual overhead cam 1.8 liter engine. And unlike the other models, the Integra was the entry point and the most critical component of Acura's branding. Without the Integra, you do not get new consumers. More people gravitated over towards Acura because the true value was in the Integra, just like the ILX. Oh God, the ILX, oh God. But the one that really kind of slipped away from us was the Vigor. Now the Vigor was unusually different because the Vigor had a 5-cylinder engine, and the thought process behind it was Honda at the time of engineering, believed that a 5-cylinder would fit a mid-size sedan because it was more powerful than a 4-cylinder engine, but it was more efficient than a 6. Your Honda, all of your engines are efficient. How much more efficient did you need to be? But the design of the 4-cylinder was longitudinally opposed, and because of that, that created some design problems in the back seat, which most people complained about. In addition to that, it was a fairly quick car. It had 176 horsepower, but there was nothing exciting about the Vigor, and most people just was like, man, I'd rather have an Integra, or I'd just rather go to another brand. Now, at the time, Acura was really pushing its presence, and there was a lot of good marketing behind it because people were beginning to synonymize the name Acura with quality and performance. You could think of them as like the BMW of Japan at the time. We kind of attribute that to Mazda nowadays, but back then it was more so Acura, and nothing else drove like an Acura in the 90s. Now, I will say there is a very interesting point. And around 1995, we began to see Acura begin to do something that they shouldn't do, and that's touch stuff.
Ooh, what does this button do? Please, do not push the button. You have no idea what.
So during the 90s, Acura really wanted to increase their sales volume because, of course, they wanted to gain market share. And what ends up happening is when people begin to touch stuff, they start to touch buttons they shouldn't. And what ends up happening is that gets up. Acura thought it was a good idea at the time to change their nomenclature to something that was a little more
Sophisticated.
There's a new direction in touring luxury sedans. One that raises levels of luxury and refinement to new heights. Introducing the new Acura TL series. If you're ready for a change, this is the turning point.
And what that really meant was we see that the Germans' formula is working, so we should follow suit. And this is kind of the first implication that we began to see Acura not necessarily becoming the innovators from the NSX, which basically they were doing Ferrari as opposed to doing Mercedes. Like,
No.
And no disrespect to either company, but you can't go from here to here. And so during that period, Acura begins to change their nomenclature and they begin to touch stuff. And we begin to see the Vigor go from the Vigor to the TL, and we begin to see the Legend go to the RL. And then they do the 3.5 and the 2.5. And it just becomes really confusing for the average consumer to really understand what's going. The nomenclature wasn't that great because we really didn't know the difference between the TL, the CL, the SLX. There were a lot of things that were going on, and the SLX is actually a joint venture between Isuzu and Acura. So we didn't even really understand is that the SLX was supposed to be our entry point into the SUV market, but it really wasn't theirs. Y'all see how this gets confusing? Aside from the nomenclatures, they kept the name the Integra, and that's the one that kept selling. What really held strong is when they introduced the Integra Type R. The Integra Type R is so iconic that it is hailed as the most potent front-wheel drive car, especially at the time, if not the best front-wheel drive handling car in the world. Even today, it was a very light chassis. It was a front-wheel drive setup. They basically stripped everything unnecessary to that car for performance reasons, and it ended up being something so truly pleasurable to any automotive enthusiast that didn't believe that front wheel drive cars could be exciting to drive. Now we enter into the 2000s, and at this point Acura has touched quite a few things that they shouldn't have touched. One of the things that they have touched is obviously the name, but they also got rid of a few different things too, and the Integra lineup was discontinued towards the 2000s. As I said before, it's the 2000s, and we enter into an anxiety-inducing era of cataclysmic events between 9/11, the dot-com bubble, and Janet's titties. There was a lot of anxiety-inducing things, especially with the war on terrorism. But one thing that was even more anxiety-inducing is the idea that we were going to have to run through 10 movies of this shit. What am I talking about? The Fast and the Furious. If you know anything about the Fast and the Furious, you know that that series has gone on for decades. Literally two, and I'm tired. I really want them to stop playing on our nostalgia. It ain't even about racing anymore. It's about espionage. And it was always about espionage, but at least we got some dynamic racing. Like the car culture at the time was so much better, but I digress. Anyway, the 2000s introduces Fast and the Furious, and this is our first true exposure to the Acura tuner scene and the capabilities at which not just Acura could do, but also Toyota, Nissan, especially with the Skyline. We begin to see a resurgence and a renaissance of luxury Japanese automotive manufacturers. Let me know in the comments what your favorite Japanese luxury automaker is. I got a feeling some of y'all like the G35. That was one of my favorites back in the early 2000s. But anyway, back to Acura. We begin to see a resurgence of Acura, and one of the first things we begin to see is the legendary to the entry tuner scene is the RSX. The RSX was really pivotal because while it was a 4-cylinder, it was almost the ghost of the Integra. It was a true successor, unlike that lame ass duck ass 7th gen Civic that nobody gave a fuck about. The Civic at the time was kind of boring and really missing a lot of bones that the 6th gen had. And so the Acura Integra did a better job of interpreting that. It came with a standard array of features. The leather was amazing, and well, it wasn't that great. It was great for the price point, but the leather was so good and the interior was clean, it was simple, and it really focused on driving. Even if you look at the center stack, it kind of points towards the driver, which was a very common thing back then. And the RSX had a 200 horsepower engine with the Type S variant, and that was the one that most people aspired for. It was fun, it was sporty, it was performance oriented. The only real issue was that it was a coupe. Everything else was boring, and the NSX kind of had been out of touch for a long time, so that really wasn't any exciting anymore. And the RSX was kind of our last hurrah before we began to see Acura put their foot off in their asses. Now, there is an interesting thing that happens around the 2000s. Alongside the introduction of the RSX, we also begin to get the introduction of the MDX. The MDX is supposed to be multi-dimensional luxury, and this is kind of going to be relevant to the story, but we're going to hold off on that. It's 2002, RSX just dropped, Type S variant just dropped, everything else is just blah. Well, later on, we begin to see the introduction of the TSX. The TSX was supposed to be the Euro-Japanese-esque Accord. And that's the one that we slept on as a people. Do you know that those TSXs can get upwards of 400,000 miles like that with the K24? It is crazy. Like, the people who truly understand Honda's engines and the performance, they know them K24s, I think it's the K24A2, that's the one that would go and go and go, okay? And I'm not trying to sound like a fanboy, but basically all I'm saying is they was worth it. Like, nobody else was touching that. And the cool thing about the TSX at the time, in addition to being a fairly mid-sized sedan, it also was made in Japan. And that was one of the coolest aspects about the TSX. The TSX also gave you bi-xenon headlight standard, it gave you sunroof, it gave you navigation system, it gave you all the cool things. Now, the only thing it didn't come with was a V6 for the first generation, but that particular model in the first generation was the one that really held on strong. That's the one that truly represented Honda quality. Now, we thought that Acura was done and we thought it was over, but in 2004, baby, let me tell y'all something. 2004 for Acura? 2004 is the introduction of the TL.
With XM satellite radio,
Find hotel.
Bluetooth wireless technology,
Dial.
and voice-activated navigation,
Do you need directions?
No thanks. I got 'em.
you are not alone. Introducing the all-new 270 horsepower Acura TL.
Now remember I said that when they was touching shit back in the 90s, they changed the name from the Vigor to the 2.5 TL. Now the 2.5 TL was originally made in Japan, but they eventually changed it and it eventually crossed over into the Americas. Designed by the famous John Ikeda, who has been the brand ambassador and basically is head of Acura now, is the one who made the legendary Acura TL. This Acura TL had so much presence that it stole and sold everybody from their Mercedes to their Beamers, even their Lexuses. Now, this had the 3.5 liter V6 that originally came with 270 horsepower, but after some SAE adjustments, child, I don't have dyslexia, but I can't spell sometimes. After some SAE adjustments, it went down to 263 horsepower, but it is amazing that that thing still looks good to this day. It had a classic design. The wheels were fashion forward. The wrap design, the TLX concept really did translate well into this one. Now, if you don't know anything about the name TL, it means touring luxury. And essentially, when they went to the nomenclature of giving letters, they thought it would be a great idea to just drop the engine because nobody really gave a f, and they would have been the f right. Nobody cared about that shit. But
He's really good looking, and he thinks I'm super cool. Sure, Jan.
the TL in 2004 was so amazing. Now, there was some problems with the transmission, so just as an FYI, just expect your fall out like you've been eating Chipotle all day and it's about to come down. I don't know what to tell you. But from a front wheel drive perspective, it had everything. Now, it was a bit heavy in comparison to the TSX, but overall, it was so gorgeous to see, and it came with so much technology. This is one of the first cars we are aware to come with Bluetooth standard as a car, and Acura really put their foot off in the TL so much that it sold 77,000 units in 2004, as one of their peaks was 78,000 going the subsequent year. So the TL was a huge piece of Acura's success in the mid 2000s. The other thing that we forget about Acura is that Acura really tried to revive the relationship of the Type S like it was a bad girlfriend that was bored, because the Type S variant is where we really truly begin to see Acura put their performance chops not quite as well as the Type R, but close enough. And that's also when we begin to see the Type S variant. Now, I myself had a Type S and it was one of the most pleasurable cars to drive. I would not encourage you to get one today, especially with low miles, because it is going to break. Everything is going to break. And this is one of the last cars that came with power steering, but it was amazing to drive. Like from the notchy gear selector to the interior, from the sound of the 3.5 liter V6 engine with the quad exhaust pipes, because this one had quad pipes. The regular TL had dual tailpipes. But this one was the one that was truly, truly, truly slept on. And lastly, next to the TL, we have the RDX. Now, y'all hold on before y'all cancel me. The RDX was underseen. This was the first time an SUV from Honda's lineup got a turbocharged engine. And it was a big one too, because it was a 2.3 liter turbocharged engine, and it had 240 horsepower, but it was a little notchy for the time, but it was innovative. The 2000s and everything else for Acura was where we began to see the innovation. That was what made Acura so strong in the 2000s. Now, I will tell y'all, it's not lost on me that Acura began to switch up the mother game. So back in 2009, that's when they was like,
Guys, I have a great idea.
Let's make the design ugly.
They didn't say ugly as but that's what it was. It was ugly. So we begin to see the introduction of the Acura TL and that damn beat grill. And I also want to talk about the RL, but I think the RL deserves its own specific video because there is a lot of history behind the RL that goes unnoticed and a lot of innovation that goes into the RL. But let's be honest, none of us really had one. Only people who are niche into that market knew about the RL. So that's really why I want to make that more special, because it is its own special entity. But the 2000s kind of stops around 2009. Now, I want to go ahead and say this much. There's a few things that went wrong with this. There's a few things that we could have done better as consumers. Nah, that's bullshit. There's a few things that Acura could have done better as a manufacturer. And I'm going to point the blame at the recession, but the hard part is that when you design a car and you design a car from top to bottom, it usually takes 2 to 3 years prior before it goes into production. With that being said, leave a comment below. Let me know what you think about Acura and where they are and the golden period, if it's truly the golden period or if it's just me. Y'all can let me know if it's just me. Otherwise, go check out my other video about Honda and its identity crisis. I think that'll kind of wrap things up a little bit better than this convoluted video because I can be a little scatterbrained at times. But I wanted to talk about this today because I thought it was really good and hopefully you guys really enjoyed it. With that being said, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. And until the next video, I will see you guys later.